Hello, in this segment, we'll be tracing the events leading to colonial victory and analyzing the factors that led to winning independence in the American Revolution. The question we want to keep in mind: what factors actually contributed to the victory for the American rebels? As we've already discussed, the first shots of the war happened at Lexington and Concord. We all remember the old poem about Paul Revere and the Midnight Ride and the British are coming, the British are coming. It didn't quite actually happen that way, but it is a nice story. It makes for a fun poem, and the result is still the same. The British troops went to Lexington and Concord looking for munitions that were apparently being stolen and held by the colonists. And they were also looking for certain individuals who were helping lead the rebel cause, guys like John Hancock and Samuel Adams. Well, as the British approached Lexington and then Concord, shots were fired. The Minutemen sprung into action. Again, these were volunteer, regular guys who happened to be upset with the British, came out of their homes, volunteered their services, were ready to fight on a minute's notice, and then ran to the aid, ran to the cause, and fought back. And they chased the British from Lexington and Concord all the way back to Boston. They never found the munitions, and that's going to later on help the American colonists win their independence. The Minutemen. It was a good thing back then. As we take a look at the early battles of the American Revolutionary War, we see that most of these happened in New England. Some certain battles of note. We want to emphasize Boston. Boston went under siege after Lexington and Concord, and the shot heard round the world. Boston was laid siege. And if you take a look at my clicker here, in the hills on the outskirts of Boston, the American rebels were able to put cannons. And with the cannons on top of the hill, they were able to drive the British out of Boston, and they were able to hold this port city. This is going to be very important to the rebel cause because this is going to be the only port city that stays in American colonial hands during the war. The next area that we want to focus on is Princeton and Trenton. The first battle was Trenton in Delaware and Pennsylvania, and then followed by Princeton. And what happened here, George Washington was able to catch the British and the Hessian soldiers, the hired Germans, quite by surprise. We like to talk about these victories because they were some of Washington's best victories. We believe he actually lost more battles than he won. Of course, after Trenton and Princeton, big wins, but then it seems that the British began to dominate. They forced the American colonial army out of major ports, out of major cities. George Washington was utterly and completely destroyed at New York. And as you can see under this circle, notice where all of these victories are falling into British hands. George Washington and his forces were forced out here into the woods of Pennsylvania, forced to hide at places like Valley Forge, where they spent a grueling and terrible winter. And it seemed that the British had pretty much dominated the middle colonies. The turning point, though, happens at Saratoga. In October of 1777, something quite amazing happens. It's a relatively small battle, but the victory of the American army at Saratoga allows Benjamin Franklin, who's hanging out over in France, trying to get some help. We were over in France trying to get money. We were trying to get soldiers. We were trying to get ammunition. We were trying to get the favor of the French king, trying to get them involved in our cause. After all, they had already said we quit during the French and Indian War. How embarrassing for them, but how much more embarrassing would it be if they supported us in our cause for independence? This battle at Saratoga gave Benjamin Franklin the argument that he needed, that yes, these American rebels could hold out long enough and force the British to surrender. And if the French could be part of that, that would make the British look even worse. So Benjamin Franklin, after the Battle of Saratoga, was able to negotiate what we call the Treaty of Alliance with France. They became formally willing to help and aid in our cause. And this changed everything. The war shifted to the south. When we take a look at the battles that were occurring here in the southern states, again, follow my pointer, please. I'd already mentioned that the British had a very strong hold here in what we would call the middle colonies. So not many more battles happened up in this area. The key commanders were sent now to the south in an attempt to dominate the port cities down here in the south, places like Charleston and Savannah, all throughout here. And they did this with relative ease. Famous generals like Lord Cornwallis came down here to conquer and hold these southern colonies, which he did. Much like up in the middle colonies, this forced the American rebels further out into the Western Territory, out here into the wilderness, where they could hide, and more importantly, where they could survive. Generals like Lord Cornwallis won the major battles, but they suffered from the hit-and-run tactics in the backcountry and the frontier. Cornwallis, while he was in full control for the most part of the South, knew that it was time to end the war. And he realized that the best way to kill any animal is to cut off its head. George Washington was going to be the head that needed to be separated from the body. As Cornwallis wrote in many of his letters, if we eliminate George Washington, victory will be ours. Follow the pointer. Lord Cornwallis had a strategy. George Washington was up in this area here. He heard that he was in Maryland and in Pennsylvania, where the rebels had a relatively strong hold. His idea is going to be to travel north from the south along this route here. He wants to get to this point right here on the Chesapeake Bay. It's a little place called Yorktown. Maybe you heard of it. His plan was to rendezvous with the British Navy at Yorktown, travel up the Chesapeake, cross over into Pennsylvania, track down George Washington, get with the British generals who are in the north, and pen him in and cut off his head, essentially eliminating the threat. Well, George Washington found out about these plans. And as Lord Cornwallis traveled north, word had already been sent out here to the Caribbean, where the British forces were, where the British Navy was. And they, unfortunately for Cornwallis, were in the process of being defeated by the French Navy. So when Lord Cornwallis arrived in Yorktown, he was waiting for the British to come up this direction. But it wasn't the British who showed up, it was the French fleet. Cornwallis was stuck in Yorktown and his ride wasn't going to show up. Meanwhile, George Washington, as I mentioned, had heard from his sources that what Cornwallis was doing. George Washington rolls down to the south and pins him in right there at Yorktown. Also, one of the most famous French generals from this war, Lafayette, joins Washington's forces along with General Rochambeau. And all together, they literally sandwiched Lord Cornwallis at Yorktown. Stuck between the French and the American forces, Lord Cornwallis was left with nothing to do but surrender. And his surrender right there at Yorktown effectively ended this Revolutionary War. At this point of time, the British realized they had spent too much time, too much money, too much effort in fighting for keeping these colonies. They decided it wasn't worth it. We will let them go. Some of the key leaders of the Revolutionary War included people like Patrick Henry. We want to associate Patrick Henry as an early patriot. Patrick Henry was moved by the ideas of Thomas Paine. Remember, we talked about him, and common sense. He helped Virginia pass the proposal to declare independence. We all recall his famous speech, "Give me liberty or give me death." That very speech was being used to address the House of Burgesses, which we have today as the General Assembly, to convince them to say, yes, let's propose independence from Great Britain. So we associate Patrick Henry as a key early patriot, stirring ideas, and a brilliant spokesman for the cause. Of course, we have to include George Washington in all of this. George Washington was essentially our father. Wait, that says master of retreat. Yes, he was. Our father of our country was a master of running away. Again, this guy won about as many battles as he lost. And by being a master of retreat, he was able to keep the forces alive, keep them out in the wilderness. As long as we were alive, we were not dead. And that was part of his simple goals. George Washington did not need to defeat the British head on. All he needed to do was outlast them. And if we could run away, if we could hide, if we could simply survive, that was enough. Do whatever it took to avoid capture. He was also very creative in his leadership. George Washington, again, separating from the classic ideas of how a battle should be carried out, George Washington resorted to hit and run tactics. The British called this cowardly and not worthy of a soldier, but George Washington knew this was going to be the way to victory. Again, he did not have to defeat them in open battle. He simply had to not surrender. He was inspirational. His words and his leadership inspired the soldiers, inspired his military leaders to follow him, and helped set the course, not just for independence, but for the government that will follow. Another one of our very important Americans from this time was Benjamin Franklin. Don't forget, he was quite a thinker from the Enlightenment age. He was a scientist, he was a writer, he was a true Renaissance man. He did a little bit of everything. And while earlier he did great things, and later he does great things, during this period of time, he helps convince the American colonies to declare independence, and perhaps most importantly, he negotiated the Treaty of Alliance with France. It was his leadership over in France, his popularity with the king and with the court, that got them to commit the troops, the money, and the resources to help win our independence. When it comes to our final analysis, the American Revolution was inspired by ideas concerning natural rights and political authority. Its successful completion affected people and governments throughout the world for many generations. The American rebels won their independence because the British government grew tired of the struggle soon after the French had agreed to help the Americans. The war did not have popular support in Great Britain. The American rebels won their independence because the British simply grew tired of that struggle. And when we consider the legacy, the colonial break from its mother country had not happened before. This was something brand new. And the successful launch of an American experiment, that experiment in democracy, would soon change the world. It would provide a roadmap for self-government for many other nations to follow.